for that. Now, I think we had a very good discussion around potential projects before lunch. What we want to move on to is the other areas, which, as I said in my introduction this morning, are the areas where IPSASB does things, but perhaps we've not been as explicit as we might have been about what are we trying to do, how are we trying to do it. And so really, in putting themes D and E into the draft strategy, we were trying to raise awareness of this issue and to begin to think about it. And it's us actually starting to operate very much in a different space with different groups and so on. So in terms of talking about the two themes, my colleague Bernard Schatz is going to talk about theme D, and Bernard has very particular experience, having been in the Ministry of Finance through their adoption of IPSAS, and now is in the Court of Audit in Austria. So I think you have a number of perspectives. And then Francesco, who is Capalbo, who is another of the board members, will talk about theme E. And Francesco very much is our link at the moment into the academic community. And he'll talk about theme E in terms of us working in that in a broader community. So, Bernard.
Thanks. It's always a bit difficult to kind of start sessions after lunch. But since you showed a lot of activity in the morning and already touched on a lot of topics we wanted to discuss in the afternoon, I'm pretty sure you will easily be able to connect and to continue the discussion. The first two slides I want to show you is showing you some sort of a dynamic we are realizing at the moment. And we already talked about dynamics. We talked about the capital markets. We talked about pensions, so demographic developments. So there are outside factors which are not really accounting issues, but will drive accounting and accounting solutions. And when we look at the landscape of the world, who's applying accrual accounting at the moment, that's kind of the picture you're getting. So it's about 38% of countries on a federal level, and that's the first point where it's kind of getting complicated. You've got different layers of government, and that there's not one picture, there's probably a selection of pictures. So you could do these slides in different layers, and you get different shapes. We talk about accrual accounting. There's a notion of harmonized accrual accounting. So a general international standard setter like IPSAS, we have a notion on a harmonized way of accrual accounting, but that's really accrual accounting in kind of different ways. And if you kind of expand this picture on the future, and that's kind of a self-assessment of governments saying, classic question in a job interview, where do you see yourself in 10 years, 15 years? That's what the countries come up with. And it's even more predominantly accrual accounting. And to be honest, I think you certainly have to recognize that there is some sort of a confirmation bias. So people tend to be very optimistic sometimes about what's capable of achieving in a certain time span, but nevertheless that shows their intention. So there's some need, or at least a feeling that accrual accounting could be useful for them. If we kind of go back and forth on this, you can kind of see where the dynamic is going on. So it's South America, it's Southeast Asia, and it's Africa. And if you can identify Europe on the slide. But usually the most common way to adopt IPSAS is in kind of transferring it into national legislation, which means you're not going to find IPSAS 1, IPSAS 2, IPSAS 3 in practice. You're going to find an accounting law, you're going to find an asset accounting regulation or something like that, and then you can have to kind of figure out how much IPSAS is in there. If you want to know more about this job, I guess you can ask Patrice, who did that job for Europe a while ago. So it's a really tricky and complicated issue, I think, in a nutshell. So coming from this dynamics, our question we asked us as a board was, what's our role in promoting the adoption and the implementation of IPSAS? Most certainly, we feel strongly about that. So we are very passionate because we do think that these are high-level quality standards and they improve decision-making and accountability. So we want them to get implemented. We want them to get adopted. But at the same time, we have to sort out two questions. About 10, 12 people coming in through working groups or task-based groups. And we got 8, hopefully 9 something full-time equivalents in the IPSASB staff. So that's kind of the firepower we're talking about. And when I remember and recall the discussions we had, and everybody was really enthusiastic about you should integrate budgeting into the IPSAS world, and you should kind of think about not just the convergence to IFRS, but also take GFS into account and so on. And all those arguments were perfectly right. There's no argument stating that that's not the way to do it, but the question is who is going to do it and in which capacity. And that's where this kind of slide come in, and I mean, that's our view on a division of labor we would propose. So we are on the view that there is the entity using accounting standards, in our case IPSAS standards. They might make some use of consultants and contractors to help them along the road, not necessarily, but most certainly they can. There are supranational governments, organizations, regional organizations like, for example, the IMF or World Bank, or even professional associations like INTOSAI, the International Network for Public Sector Auditors, the OECD, and so on. So there are many of them. They have a certain position of good practices, a certain position on what kind of reporting needs are in the public sector. So they also join this group. And then we have the IPSASB as a body. And we clearly see our role in the promotion of the standards, because that's kind of following the lines on, if you do something good, talk about it. So don't be shy mentioning it. And the second part is about technical guidance, because usually if you have and Ian already talked about this, if you have an implementation project, it's not the standards, it's not kind of resolving everything. It's not ending the story, it's the start of the story. You take the standard, you look at it, and then you kind of have a lot of questions in your mind, a lot of procedural issues. And the question is, to what extent can the board give you some technical guidance on these issues? And I mean, to this kind of 2 bullets, we have, I think, a quite active outreach program if you compare it to other boards that are around in a similar nature. What we talked about is, at the moment, it's member driven. So if there is a strong relationship between the member and the institutions in the country, there's going to be a relationship, there's going to be contributions from the IPSASB to certain events. We don't have a policy at the moment on whether or not it's possible to get an IPSASB input to a certain type of conference. We are, at the moment, I'd say it's fair to say, not actively monitoring schedules of big events, asking ourselves whether or not we have to contribute there. So that's a bit the discussion we have about the promotion area, I guess. And again, it's coming back to capacity, because people are not available all the time, and then somebody has to cover the cost. I think it's more straightforward on the technical guidance side. And as we discussed already in this group, not every public sector specific issue might have to be addressed with a standard. And I think that's very important for us because, and maybe we have time to kind of touch on this as well. If we follow on a standard or we try to come up with a standard, usually we talk about, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, but at least 1.5 years, I'd say, and that's quite a quick standard. So there's a lot of work going around for a standard, but it's easier for us to give at a glance, maybe just a summary of a certain economic phenomena, type of transaction. We do webinars, and I think that's a good thing, in different languages, where people who are either staff or members or technical advisors, I guess, give a view on the standard and how it was developed and what the key points are. And we do staff papers and questions and answers. And those are kind of, you could call them kind of limited effort areas where we can put out a nice piece of work in quite a short amount of time on a considerable effort from the board. And we hope that is kind of also helpful and helps to resolve some of the issues we can't address with the standard setting. And I guess the really big point from us is getting your feedback on how do you think how useful that could be. Because we are kind of struggling with these capacity issues like any entity would. And giving us direction on whether you think that's useful or you'd say if it's not a standard, it's not of any worse for us, that would be helpful. Maybe to give you an idea about how we work in practice, we just thought about giving an example. And since we're in Europe and we are in Brussels, the obvious example was the IPSASB project. And Thomas touched on the IPSASB project in his introduction. And to be honest, if you know the history of the IPSASB project, you will be aware of the fact that at the very beginning there was an assessment whether or not IPSAS would be suitable for the European Union. And at that point in time, I think for very sound reasons, and the criticism was about the governance structure and the lack of certain type of standards, it was rejected being suitable for Europe. And I guess instead of being a bit angry about this decision and kind of shying away from getting into touch with the people, IPSASB decided to help the group of European countries along the way, because most certainly at the moment you don't have any IPSAS standard, so you have to start somewhere, and the obvious point to start is the IPSAS standard that is out there. And what we are currently doing is we are participating in the working groups, mainly giving an idea about what's the IPSAS standard about and why is it compiled that way and what kind of notion is behind that, and just helping Eurostat and the group of member states to make an informed decision, because that's what they're trying to do. They want to decide on whether there's a suitable set of accounting standards for the European Union, and we really try to inform the decision making on that. The same is true for the working group itself, where the IPSAS board is an observer and is kind of giving updates on the development on the IPSAS or for specific issues. And there's also a regular working relationship between the Eurostat staff and the IPSASB staff, because getting heads around military assets was mentioned. I mean, that's a very interesting issue, and it's getting even more interesting if you multiply it by 28, 27, whatsoever. And that's really getting that down to the technical questions you have to answer with an accounting standard. It's not always an easy job, so it's kind of a joint undertaking to help us along the way. And I mean, that's also a clear point. That's never going to be an IPSAS implementation. So if IPSAS follows through, they might be inspired by IPSAS, and there might be a lot of same concepts used, but it's not an IPSAS implementation story. And I think the point is that we as a board are more than okay with that, because we recognize we are an international standard setter, but there are different jurisdictions around, and there are different legal requirements, different elements of administration, democratic constitutions, and so on. So we are not regulating that. So if there is a need to get some national element to that, that's totally fine. With that, I would be on the question whether or not you agree with us, and I kind of put some emphasis on that, using additional elements other than standard in our way of promoting the adoption and implementation of IPSAS, and whether or not you could think of maybe additional elements we have missed when it comes to technical guidance or promotion, or do you think we have a mandate, and I can put the slide back up again probably, when it comes to financing or practice or capacity development, which we clearly said we don't have a stake at the moment. So that's what we would ask you to do. Thanks.
Discussions, and then we'll just take some points from tables at the end of that, and again get you to fill in your voting forms before we move on to theme E.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Okay. It's feel embarrassed. No, come on.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, we haven't done that. I realize.
You stand in the middle because then we can read the
The accountancy. Yeah, that's true. I can stand anywhere, actually. That's the delivery.
Behind it, or how is it?
Okay.
No, we were just saying the smaller ones so that you can
I'm
read
going in the middle
Oh,
to make
but
the
I think anyone else, I have to do this.
Yeah.
Is there,
Yeah, John, are you?
no, John? Oh, no, John.
John,
Yeah, John, of course.
let me squeeze
Oh,
in the middle.
let's quiz like
So
this.
let's,
Maybe it's better. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a little
Okay.
bit like that.
It's not a breakfast.
Okay.
Okay,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect.
No, excellent when a picture of me was taken, but it is good.
learning afterwards, but when I read the word But I talked to one of those persons and they said, well, then wants to promote it, then this is no. I read it. It's there.
Yes.
But that's an act of great.
Let me try and nail down.
Yeah.
Respect time.
What's in terms of talking?
Yeah, in terms of talking timing. I don't need much time. Just tell me, tell me.
So, I mean, I think I've sort of allocated 5 minutes, but if it's 10 minutes, then
No, it'll be 5 7 minutes, no more than
that's
that.
fine.
No worries.
Okay, so as ever, cutting into the conversations, and I can hear good conversations going on. What it's been suggested is, as with the discussion before lunch, where we picked up in plenary themes A and B project recommendations together, the suggestion's been made that we pick up themes D and E together in terms of plenary discussions. So what we're going to do is then just slightly alter the running order and ask Francesco to talk about theme E, then have some table discussions around theme E, and then we'll bring it back together as a plenary discussion after that. So, Francesco, over to you.
Thanks. Okay. Thank you, Ian. Thank you all. We'll get straight ahead to the slide. Okay, well, I have a few words. They're just two, but they're very thick, so beware. So of course, there have been saying many words on accrual accounting, cash basis. I will not go tracing back the whole story. Just what I wish it to say today is, of course, with accrual accounting, we just follow the whole health of an entity. So it's not just the cash and the financial part, but the whole health. So what I'm asking myself and asking all of you, if a family has to control whether the goals are sustainable, the goal that it's got for its kids, would the family follow just the financial information, its financial resources, or will also consider whether the houses, the apartments, and what is is worth something or is crumbling? So what I'm trying to say, as a family, I will follow not just the state of my financial resources and the change and the reasons of the change, but I also will follow the whole resources. So, and the same has to work, of course, when we get to public entities. And public entities have to consider both all the resources, both the financial and non-financial resources. And with accrual accounting, then you have a more, I would say, a comprehensive information. So I'm not still talking about whether it's a better information, it's a worse information, but definitely it's a wider information. It's a wider information where cash is not lost, so cash is still there. It doesn't mean that you don't follow the cash anymore, of course. And as the family, I would say, it must consider whether its goals are sustainable. Of course, it's the same for a public entity. What about the future generation? So the way we are living, it's a way that we can continue in the future. Are we saving for future generation? So intergenerational equity, for instance, is a key. It's a key point, intergenerational equity, and this is very up to date today, especially in countries like this continent where people is aging. Therefore, but intergenerational equity is a very tough word. It's the key, but it's not the only thing. I mean, there are many information that I got with accrual accounting. There are information that are concerned with that even from a policy budget perspective, a statistic perspective, and accounting perspective. I try always to make a little example to my kids that are kind of younger than you are at the moment. No offense, but this is a matter of fact. And and they're much younger than I am, of course. And if you take two municipalities, right? One municipality is taking care of its roads, is doing maintenance, and is spending money on maintenance. The other municipality is not doing any maintenance, is not spending money on maintenance. The second municipality will have a better financial position. But will it really better off than the first one? Just a question. Probably not. So probably we do need to have that information. It doesn't mean that if I start following that information, I will not take care anymore of the cash flow, because if I don't care about the cash flows, I will not be having cash to pay the maintenance. So the two things are together. And so, of course, we are strongly supporting, and as IPSAS and as IPSAS members and all the, has been said before, to raise awareness about the importance of this kind of information. But we're not alone. We're not alone. We're not alone because there are regional and national organizations that are doing the same. And most likely, these regional and national organizations are doing it with a strong link with the background. So they do know the needs of that particular background. And since this is a topic which is really multi-phased, of course, in different environments, you might have different needs from constituents. And we need to know those needs, because diversity is a value. Oh, sorry, I removed that. Yeah, sorry, it's diversity. That's great. Yeah, that's it's much more rocky. It works in? All right, okay. So diversity is a value. Everywhere diversity is a value. But also, if diversity is a value, I think cooperation is even a greater value. So we do not just want to see what the others have done, but we want to cooperate. That's what we have done. We have built a relationship with the IMF and World Bank. We had the joint seminar with IMF last March in Washington, and work with regional organizations. And especially it's important, in my perspective as an Italian, I would underline the importance of relation with INTOSI and the Court of Auditors that in many countries, whose voice in many countries is very well, it's heard even more than the voice of politicians, participate in key events and engaging with the others, but also taking part in trainings, so helping in training people from different organizations, and also, I won't go to the last one, contribute to the governance finance statistics. I must confess that as an academic, as an accounting academic, when I stepped into the board, I knew just a little about GFS. Well, maybe even less than a little. I didn't know anything, honestly. And, but now I think GFS is everywhere. I mean, anytime you take an agenda paper of the IPSASB, it's talking about GFS. So there is I personally have learned a lot about that, and it is important that we converge on this point. Another point is to encourage development of with the academic community. This is, of course, let me be on that side. It's very important because, for instance, just one example, we need evidences. We need research. The point is that at the moment, there is a lot of research that is going on public sector accounting and the use of IPSAS. But at the moment, there is no link. What I'm trying to say, there is a lot of people doing a lot of work. If we manage to work in the same direction, it will be better for all of us. We're thinking about that. With John, we have been thinking about that. But for instance, say, it would be interesting, I think, for the academic community to know what are our research needs. Do we have any call for research? We might be interested in knowing what is the state of the art, but we might be interested in knowing the experience of other countries. So we need to link of that in order to increase the value of what we can achieve all together. And also, I think this is very important in the whole process. I believe that the involvement of the academic community, if it gets at the exposure draft level, is too late. It should come before. Should come when we start a project, when we do the analysis of the literature, so that might help us also to ground our basis for conclusion, not just in our previous IPSASB literature, but also in other literature. I think with this, we're quite open on that. We're thinking about how to do it. If we get information and suggestions from you, it will be even better. And we have one more reason to build on the link with the academic community. It's Luca Pacioli that is watching us. Is there? Look at him. So there is controlling us. And when Luca Pacioli came out with double keeping, you might all know that double keeping, it was born as a control system. You have debit and credit because the real need was to control how much the people owned you and how much you had to give to the people. So if at that stage they've started with double keeping to have a better control of their resources, we might keep on that track and helping the government to have a better control on their resources. With this, I think we can open the discussion. Did I respect the timing? I think it was right. So and the timing there is our. So the question is, but I'll leave the question to.
Yeah, no. Thanks, Francesco. I think that's great, and that is a good introduction to this area. And just one thing that I might underline, which I think is a subtlety, but it is quite important in terms of the difference between theme D and theme E. Theme D, the idea is that focuses very much at sort of jurisdiction level, and we're talking about IPSAS, whereas theme E is much more broad-ranging and it talks about accrual. So it's a more general, high level.
Yeah, that's the idea. That's why I said to build on the work that others have done, because maybe there are some other countries have done some steps, so they already tackled some issues, and so we don't. The idea of the IPSASB, as far as I understood, is not to arrive and to erase all that has been done and starting from the scratch, but often it's very important to build on what has been done already. That's the overall idea.
Yeah, that's right. So if we take 15 minutes then in terms of table discussions, and then we'll bring it back in terms of having a plenary discussion and just hear some of the key points that tables have been discussing on both themes D and E.
Okay.
And then you get to vote again.
Well, if he has to be London, but if it's Miami, that's good because I think because it's far almost managers to people who make decisions.
So I heard you.
That's good information that you gave me because at the stage I was still thinking about my original idea was to get in touch with which is pretty much
requirements and resources. Therefore, perhaps it might be
So you think out there, like,
Everybody's involved. But also
Okay, so if we bring the table discussions to a conclusion and then get some feedback from the tables. Okay, so given we picked up both themes D and E, if I could get some points from any of the tables on your thoughts on this. Jens.
Thank you, thank you. I mean, we thought of maybe two main points. So the one side, with regards to promoting and adopting IPSAS, was providing technical guidance. I mean, we had this idea of having an interpretations committee that will also be a contribution in the adoption of IPSAS, and countries or jurisdictions might be more willing to go in that direction when they know, when they have questions, that there is an interpretations committee helping them in the implementation. So that was one point. And then with regards to capacity building, I mean, one point that we discussed was success stories and best practices. So have to have a little bit more, a better overview on what are really the best practices to look at. That would be certainly helpful in the IPSAS adoption. And also material that is explaining the standards. So, I mean, there is already a lot of going on in terms of webinars and so on, but there, I mean, on the basic standards, I mean, IPSAS 17 and so on, so there could be a little bit more background probably on that. And then one thing that we discussed was on the illustrative financial statements of having that. So also going the direction of best practice, but that could also be something that would help in promoting the adoption of IPSAS. Yeah, that was it in a nutshell.
Okay, thanks, Jens. Yep, so comments over there.
Thank you. Just a couple of comments. We basically agreed on theme D with one important proviso that maybe adoption and implementation might be separated out. They're very big, chunky pieces of work, and to roll them into all the one might be worthy of reconsideration. And we would also question the resources available for the implementation side. And we'll go back to our question we asked this morning: what does adoption mean to different people? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'll take any more comments before sort of responding. I mean, I think, yeah, Thomas.
Yeah, if there's nobody else, then again, I would touch on the points which were discussed in the CAG. Again, and this is why it makes a lot of sense to have theme D and E discussed together. The CAG had a discussion regarding priority between D and E, and actually, when looking at what happens currently, I think the CAG came up with the view that at short term, I think there should be priority to theme E, so advocating the use of accruals, the benefits of accruals, and kind of under which consideration accruals make sense to the public sector in the short term, and on the long term, then kind of advocating the implementation of IPSAS based on that. I think that was the first point. In kind of promoting the benefits of accruals, I think the recommendation of the CAG was to link the discussion to kind of issues which are of societal importance in order to get more kind of attention in the broader press. Things like, and I think Francesca has already mentioned that, demographic changes. So who is to kind of bear the burden of pensioners in the future, as an example, climate change. So what is the impact of climate change to public sector infrastructure? How to cover that, and how to get kind of a clear picture of what is the shape of infrastructure being impacted by climate change. But also kind of income inequality and societal issue like that. With kind of a reflection to social benefits needed. So I think there is a big link between what the board is doing and the big social issues, and that should be emphasized a little bit more in following up theme E. I think in summary that was the CAG discussion on that.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. I mean, it does come back to sort of, if you like, what's our role? How can we actually work with others, really, in terms of that? There's a kind of, you know, there's a multiplier effect and all that kind of thing in terms of having an impact, but it's also about the dialogue about relevance. You know, the evidence base, I think, is an important part, because, you know, if people are having a conversation about, well, what's the relevance, how does it work, and so on, actually the stories, the sharing of experience, the value add, I think becomes really important.
Just one issue which I just forgot regarding implementation. I think it was mentioned by this table over there. I think CAG warned the board to get too much involved in implementation discussion. I think there was one aspect regarding implementation, which was that probably in looking at the increasing dynamic of adoption and implementation, however you define that, I think there will be much more kind of communication backwards to the IPSASB based on experiences from implementation and adoption, which certainly will have an influence on standard setting. So from that direction, yes, there was an influence of implementation, but not getting stuck into implementation guidance. I think the CAG very much followed your table of shared responsibility and where is your stake. You should focus on standard setting and take into consideration experiences of implementation, but not try to kind of build bridges towards implementation guidance. I think that's...
And I think that, you know, back to the point being made over there, I think we should be clearer about more general, if you like, support for adoption for a move to accrual, or if you're already on accrual, from national GAAP to IPSAS-based approach. I think that's different to then support for implementation in terms of new standards, different focus, different audiences, and you know, I think the table starts that process, but I think there's probably more thinking that's actually required. And then I think that does link into the sort of points that were coming out of the discussion on your table there, Jens, because I think this is where the board is actually moving. And if you look at the overall picture that Bernard painted in terms of the move to accrual reporting that, you know, is going on at the moment, then what's our responsibility as a board in terms of supporting the specifics, the generalities of that move? And we've not had to particularly engage with that before. We've very much been focused on, we need to get standards in place. Well, actually, this is now what it's the board maturing, I think, in terms of actually we're now having a standard suite that is being used directly or indirectly around the world across different jurisdictions, different challenges that they're facing, which is then the point about feedback. How do we get those feedback loops actually working, and how do we respond to that, and whether that's through additional implementation guidance, whether that's through moving to some form of interpretation, capacity. I think those are the sorts of challenges that await us, you know, that are out there, and it's really a question of how we chart our way through that, I think, over the next few years, and recognise this is going to be an ongoing process. But we need to be clear about how we're actually trying to do it, because I think, you know, even just thinking about, well, what are we doing, what are we not doing, actually becomes a useful thought process, because it's then useful to have that dialogue, you know, with the World Bank, with IMF, with the African Union, all those sorts of organisations, different perspectives, different positions, different degrees of influence. But undeniably, those those regional organisations, I think, are very important and can be very important advocates. It's then a different debate that you have at a jurisdiction level. How do you actually get support for adoption with particular politicians and so on? So many different features, but actually us being clear about what our role is and how we support that, I think then becomes really important. Okay, any more points people want to make on that? I think, you know, it's kind of come up. It was interesting how it came up earlier on, but I think it's also, you know, it's the discussion just now has taken that further. Yeah, Jim.
let's suppose that many countries, many jurisdictions are adopting and even implementing accrual accounting all over the world. Let's suppose that this is true, that this becomes the reality. But all these jurisdictions and countries do not follow IPSAS, but for instance, in a first jurisdiction, their own business accounting legislation, in another jurisdiction, another differing system, in another jurisdiction, again something different, then the fourth one, IPSAS exactly, then the fifth one, almost IPSAS, then the sixth one, and again and again. How would you react from the IPSAS board? When would you be satisfied? Would you say, oh, everybody is using accrual, that's fine? Or would you say, oh yes, but we have created an enormous different system, or drifting apart system, or something like that? How would your reaction be, if I may ask you?
I mean, I think in an ideal world, you would say there is one set of standards, there is one way of actually doing this. I think we have to be realistic about it, that at a first stage, you don't, you know, if you're in a jurisdiction, you don't necessarily have the same drivers as there were for IFRS adoption. Actually, it's quite a big leap as a government to say we are going to invest in actually moving our accrual to accrual reporting, let alone to accrual budgeting, and that discussion has to happen at a national level. I think realistically, and again I say this as a former Ministry of Finance official, there is a reluctance to say we will commit ourselves absolutely, unequivocally to following standards set by an organisation, an international organisation. You know, you want that ability to say there might be circumstances where we will not follow that, and I think that's the first. I think that's the first sort of position that you get to, which is why you see, you know, Philippine public sector accounting standards, Malaysian public sector accounting standards, not because they are necessarily different. In most cases, if you look at them, they are very much based on IPSAS, but you've still got that kind of safety valve, if you like. And so I think that pragmatically has to be what we're aiming for, that there is still this debate about whether to move to accrual or not, how you use that accrual information. What we have to do is put in place strong standards that actually can provide the basis for all of that. Then I think the second stage starts to kick in, which is actually having moved to accrual, which is the big change. Actually, once you're on accrual, moving from one set of standards to another has its challenges, yes, but you know, actually they are relatively restricted, relatively bounded, because that's where, for example, the involvement of the ratings agencies, as an example, will come in, because they will be saying, we want consistent information. Why is it that you are not on the same standards? So they're really using the information, but you have to go through the first stage, I think, to get to the second stage. So yeah, in an ideal world, but I think I'm a pragmatist, so I think that first step is going to be really important for most jurisdictions. And then we move into that second stage, and I think it'll be interesting to see how divergent people actually are. You know, once they're actually on accrual, probably the main area of divergence at the moment would be whether you put your pension liabilities on balance sheets or not. But I'm not going into that at the moment. I mentioned it once, and I think I got away with it. Patrice, final comments, and then you know, sorry. Okay. Patrice, did you?
Well, very quickly. Thank you, Anne. So I just want to add to what just said. On the political angle, I fully understand what you say. Every country will call IPSAS for Malaysian public sector accounting standards, but very often when you look behind, it's IPSAS. It's just that, you know, also in the private sector in Europe, you do not use IFRS as adopted by, well, as issued by the ISB. You use IFRS as adopted by the European Union. You still have that safeguard. But I really see also maybe the danger to too much in the communications do the difference between accrual and IPSAS, because what you need is good accrual. And when you have to start from scratch, just think IPSAS from the start. So indeed, I even if I understand what you say, there might be some danger in insisting too much on the difference between the two in the communication.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we do have to be very careful about that, how that's nuanced, how that's, you know, that's communicated. But, I mean, it's interesting, just picking up on your point, I think if I look at what's going on in terms of adoption around the world, and let's just talk adoption for a minute. Actually, I think the point you made is entirely right now, that because the IPSAS suite is increasingly mature, it's covering the issues, people will say, well, why do we need to do anything else? We maybe need to review them, and you have that endorsement mechanism. It's interesting that the more fundamental debates are actually where you do already have sets of standards that people have developed and have thought about. And actually then there is a real, you know, there is a real debate about, is this a set of standards that we want to, you know, can support our work? Is it a set of standards that we want to in some way, you know, adopt and implement? And so that's perfectly fine. Why shouldn't you have that debate? I think personally, I think that just strengthens our standards as, you know, we draw on that experience and we respond to that debate. And I think that's what you can see happening through the debate in Europe around, you know, it's in the IPSAS arena. But I think that's produced, you know, the background information that's been produced for that, the evidence that's come through that. Certainly we've been listening to that debate, and it's certainly, I think, strengthening our debate. So I think we just have to, that's the environment we're in over the next few years. But I think we as a board must respond to that, must embrace that, you know, and be open to that debate. Yeah.
Yeah, just one last remark, building on what you just said. I think what we see globally is kind of a trend, kind of getting rid of discussions on a national level where to kind of have deviations and specific issues in the country, more towards kind of bringing the issues into the IPSASB discussion. And I think that's exactly what Europe is doing at the moment, just to say, okay, if we want to get it right, if we want to get it suitable for us, there is the need to influence the IPSAS discussion, and via that then bring it in backwards into the national application of that, instead of every country discussing why are we specific and where should we deviate. I think we see much more kind of dynamic discussion involvement of more and more countries in the IPSASB discussion, which is a good development.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm sure the IPSASB members that are present would agree with this. I don't think the IPSASB sees itself as having all the answers. I think that's actually why, you know, it's really great being involved in the development of standards and thinking in terms of how accrual can support stronger public financial management, because we don't have all the answers. There are still significant areas of debate, discussion, and so on. But I think it's that debate and that exchange of ideas which will inform that as we go forward. I think that is really important, and that's really what these kinds of fora are about. It's actually getting that debate and that exchange of ideas, you know, and getting ideas in. Francesco.
Just one point, because Hyun made a very nice example. It just to say, I think we have to also to see what happened in the private sector. Like, if you see when IFRS got implemented by listed companies, as far as Italy is concerned, we have also seen an incredible improvement of Italian accounting standards for unlisted company, because of course, even if those companies were not applying those IFRS, there was always the trend to comply with that. It was a challenge. So even in that case, I think in those countries where IPSAS would not be implemented, they would still be having a very important role as a quality benchmark, and it will be always a stimulus to keep on improving. So I think we cannot expect, it's not reasonable to expect the whole of world will use IPSAS, but I think still it's very important to have some quality reference at international level and will help the national to improve, even if in the first phases, as Thomas was saying, it could be either way, that IPSAS will improve because of the information they got from the other ones. So.
Okay. So good discussion there. I think it shows we're in a very dynamic environment, but I think it does show the importance of communication both ways, and that feedback and that input, you know, from adoption actually is going to be really important. So if I can ask you to fill your forms in on both those questions against themes D and E, and then we're going to break at that point. Then we come back and we'll pick up a little bit of the perspective in terms of theme C, but then focus in specifically on the challenges around social benefits. So if you can fill your forms in, and then if we can say we will start again at 3:25, please. John, I just want to work out what we want to say in terms of closing comments, and Thomas said you've been sort of taking notes and so on as we go along.
Yeah.
So I just want to pick up what should be the kind of, you know, half dozen key takeaways.
Yeah, okay, I'll take a look at that. Yeah, let's see.
Well, we're just going to go to the Lisbon room and just have a... All right. get back up, please. I wasn't sure which laptop we were on. Oh, okay. So I'll just click through. That's fine.
Deja vu from
Short recap.
your day.
Yeah. You've heard about the phrase life flashing before your eyes. Well, this is the IPSASB equivalent. Okay. Right. So we've been through, if you like, at a high level, the material that's in the strategy and work plan. And one of the areas that I know has come up in the sort of, some of the side discussions is this question around theme C and what exactly are we proposing to do? What are our thoughts in that space? And is it right that there isn't a specific project that we're proposing? And I think, probably the first thing to say is not that, the board doesn't see this as important. Actually, one of the reasons for proposing it as a theme is actually to say we do need to start to do some work in this area. The question is, do we do that on our own? Do we do it with others? And I think that's where actually there is quite a lot going on in this space, whether you're looking at integrated reporting, whether you're looking at what ISB is doing. And a lot of that actually, without too much of a stretch, you can actually see applying in the public sector. Indeed, if you look at integrated reporting, and I've been involved, in some work in that space through my work with SIPFA. Actually, I think the ideas in integrated reporting can more easily sit with the way in which the public sector thinks about itself in terms of its impact on society, in terms of the fact that it's used to thinking about services, targets, outputs, all those kinds of things. So, the question is not, I think, will we, to reject ever doing anything on it. The question is now the time really, bearing in mind limitations on resources and the other pressures. And so that's why what we're actually proposing is that we should, more actively engage with these projects. And for example, the question that we're kicking around at the moment is ISB is putting together I think they call it consultation group.
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
In
consultation
terms of
advisory.
in terms of their review of management commentary. Well, actually, shouldn't we aim to be part of that group? Similarly, having a closer dialogue with the International Integrated Reporting Council, things like that, so that actually we are taking, even if we're not putting any projects in place in this space, we're actually saying we will take a more concrete step. We will actually involve ourselves in those, and actually then we will report back on what we're actually doing in that space. And I think that report back, that link to where our plans are in terms of use and resources becomes more important. So we are saying this would be an area that would be visible in terms of what we're doing. We're just not proposing specific projects at the moment. Now, having said that, in discussing putting the strategy to bed for consultation purposes, that came up at the same time as we were actually finalising ED63 on social benefits. And one of the key debates was really over what's the role of long-term financial sustainability information linked to how do you actually report social benefits within the general purpose financial statements. And that was really why we started the project that became RPG1 on long-term financial sustainability in the first place, because we were conscious of the limitations around financial statements, general purpose financial statements, and the need for something more. So that was where that project came from. Now, really then in finalising the exposure draft, that was where the board had a debate around that. should we make that guidance mandatory rather than recommended? And that was why we asked some questions in the exposure draft. So given that social benefits is one of the most difficult issues that the board has had to deal with, and it has been on our agenda for a long while. The first work was done on this area back in 2002, 2003. We wanted to take the opportunity of having you as a group of interested stakeholders together to ask you two questions, which are really around specifically the recognition issue that we have and the recommendation that we have, but also linking it then with the discussions we've had. Actually, should we think about more work in this area around long-term financial sustainability? So John's going to give you the background for those of you that haven't already sort of input to responses either through Accountancy Europe or national responses into the social benefits issues. And then we just want to get your feedback really on those two issues in terms of having heard this, what do you think? And then we will feed that back into the board's deliberations, and the board will have its first discussion around responses to ED63 in June. And at the moment, the target is that we finalise a standard by the end of the year. But that's subject to what people say. And if people say we've got it wrong and we have to think again, then we have to think again.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Ian. And Ian, I think, has very neatly given the link between theme C and what I'm going to say on social benefits, because regardless of what I say about the different possible recognition points, the different measurement approaches, I think we're all agreed that the financial statements themselves don't give users everything they need to know about the sustainability of programs delivering social benefits. And really that's the case wherever you go in the world. I once made the mistake in Southeast Asia of saying, you know, this probably isn't very interesting to you all because it's a problem which is a problem of North America and Europe. And I was firmly put in my place and told, no, this is a big issue, you know, all over the world. So with that, just to reiterate also what Ian said, we've been doing work in this space. We called it social policy obligations back in 2002 when we started the work. A lot of people who subsequently joined our board got their first exposure to the board through the work they've done on that, including Thomas in front of me, and amazingly, he's still with us as chair of the CAG. If we think about it, it was a major area of criticism in that first scoping report which preceded the initiation of the IPSASB project. They were critical of our lack of a conceptual framework. They were critical of the lack of formal governance. It was also very critical of the fact that one of the major areas of government expenditure, we didn't and still don't have a standard. So in the latest attempt to bridge that gap, we've made a number of changes. First of all, we've significantly narrowed the definition of social benefits. And if we look at that slide, the existing definition is in the, which we're proposing in ED63, is in that green box. All the other expenditure areas addressed on that slide are dealt with elsewhere. At the bottom of the slide, we've got what we call normal commercial transactions. So employee benefits, insurance contracts, straightforward contracts for goods and services which may ultimately be used in the provision of benefits to citizens and other eligible beneficiaries. But they're either dealt with in existing standards, IASB standards in the case of insurance contracts, contracts for goods and services. We've already talked about the fact this morning that we've got a quite complex project on revenue, and they would fit into the IFRS 15 convergence stream of that project. Moving to the top of that slide, if you go back to our last work on this subject, back in 2007, 2008, we included collective services, by which I mean things like defence, street lighting, policing, and universally accessible services, healthcare and education. They were included within the definition of social benefits. We've now taken them outside that definition. They're being addressed in a project on non-exchange expenses. Okay. If we move on, we issued a consultation paper in 2016 that proposed 3 broad options or approaches to recognition and measurement. On the left, the obligating event approach. And within that obligating event approach, we had a number of sub-options. So that approach hid a multitude of possibilities. Then we had something called the social contract approach, you know, part stimulated by political philosophers like Rousseau, Montesquieu, also by the notion of an executive contract in commercial parlance. The idea of this is that the state may have an obligation to deliver goods and services to beneficiaries, but those beneficiaries also have an obligation to contribute taxes and other social contributions in order to finance those programs. What's the net result? The net result would be that you would only recognise legal obligations. So this would be a very narrow approach to the recognition of expense and liabilities for social benefits. Following consultation, this didn't get a lot of support, and the views reinforced IPSASB's views that this isn't really consistent with our conceptual framework because it does limit liabilities just to legal obligations. It doesn't include non-legally binding obligations, what traditionally in the Anglophone world we've always called constructive obligations. And thirdly, an option to use insurance accounting where the programme has the characteristics of an insurance programme. And that was really inspired by work going on in New Zealand, who actually use this approach. They now use it for the financials in areas like accident compensation, where they feel that the scheme basically has the features of an insurance contract. So that's the 3 we proposed in the consultation paper, and through that consultation process, we eliminated option 2. I said that the obligating event approach had 5 or 6 sub-options, and they're listed at the bottom of that slide. These are all the points at which we felt an obligating event might take place, giving rise to a present obligation and a liability. And the further to the left in that diagram, the greater the expense and the greater the liability. So on the left, key participatory events. This school of thought suggests that a liability may arise before a beneficiary satisfies the eligibility criteria. Perhaps when they first start making a contribution to a program, perhaps when they first start making, they first enter the workforce. If you talk to some actuaries, they'd actually say it's even before you're born. So, you know, this would give rise to a very large liability and expense. Secondly, a view that once a beneficiary meets the initial set of eligibility criteria in order to establish entitlement, then there is a liability, and you use actuarial techniques to determine how big that liability is. In a context of a state pension, that would mean that when somebody hits the retirement age, you make an estimate of the amount that the state is going to incur for the rest of their life. The 3 on the right are much more restrictive. They basically link eligibility criteria either to receipt of the next benefit, the next instalment, to approval of the claim, or, much more narrowly, to an enforceable claim. In other words, a beneficiary actually being able to go to a court of law or a administrative tribunal and enforce payment. So basically, that really is a legal obligation. So the earlier the recognition point, the greater the expense, the greater the liability, the greater the implications for the reporting entity. And what we've now done is to try and refine this thinking as we develop an exposure drive, as we move we move to the ED and as we move towards an IPSAS. And we're basically saying that the 3 points in that right-hand side of the diagram can really be condensed to one. And it's eligibility criteria met to receive the next benefit, and being alive in order to receive that benefit is a recognition criterion. What that means is that the liability and expense is restricted at a maximum to the amount of the next benefit payable. And that is the view of the board which was expressed in ED 63. However, there certainly is a view, and this is a view of some board members, given the complexity of this topic, that for some programs, not all, and there will need to be professional judgment to determine which, the obligating event should be at an earlier stage. Staff still aren't very keen. Staff are trying to suggest to most board members that we should, at the very least, eliminate key participatory events. But some of our board members think that key participatory events, obligating event, is valid for certain programs. And then again, that once somebody's met the eligibility criteria, you should do an actuarial-based measurement. Okay. And this is one of the major issues we're having to grapple with as we move towards finalisation of an IPSAS, which Ian has said we are very much hoping will occur quite soon. The disclosures, well, 3 groups of disclosure. We're proposing that, firstly, disclosure of the characteristics of the social benefit scheme, the nature of the benefits provided, the key features, how it's funded, and a description of any significant amendments to the scheme since the last reporting date. Second category deals with amounts in the financial statements, really giving further information on what is in the face of the statement, including a reconciliation from the opening balance to the closing balance of the liability. And lastly, and this speaks to comments which have been made at various points today, that the accrual basis does not negate the need for cash flow information, an estimate of the undiscounted cash flows, cash outflows, and the assumptions used to determine those figures. And at the moment, we're contemplating a 5-year time horizon for those cash flows. This really speaks back to theme C and the point that both Ian and I have made, that if we learnt something from the previous work which has gone on in this area, even though disappointingly it's not come to fruition in terms of a pronouncement, it's that the financial statements can't tell you everything you want to know about the sustainability of a social benefit programme. Why is that? Because if we take the dark shaded areas on that diagram, they're the information components that the financial statements can provide. They can provide information on past cash flows, the assets obtained and realised to date, how those assets have been impaired and depreciated. On the liability side, they give information on liabilities incurred and settled. They will give some future information, the present economic benefits, present social service potential of assets, and the economic sacrifices needed to settle liabilities in the future. But they don't provide information on expected resources to be realised, obtained in the future, notably taxation resources. And many of those who argue for rather a limited recognition of an expense and liability do so on the basis that giving a large liability without information on future taxation gives a slightly distorted picture. Similarly, there are a large number of obligations that entities enter into which are not present obligations and don't give rise to liabilities. And they will not be recognised on the balance sheet. What am I talking about there? Well, future expenditure on defence, future expenditures on universal education, healthcare. They're three of the main ones I can think of. So the view is that in order to have a fuller picture, you need details of these cash inflows and cash outflows. And at that point, I'm going to close off. And we've got two questions here. The first question is, do you agree with IPSASB's proposed recognition approach? The green option. What do I mean by the green option? Let's go back to the slide. It's that point on the right-hand side, that refinement of those 3 points that we exposed in a consultation paper. So eligibility criteria met to receive the next benefit, having to stay alive as a recognition criterion. In other words, if the state pension, you have to satisfy eligibility criteria once every year, you may have to stay alive in order to get the full amount over the subsequent year. If you die halfway through the year, you will only be eligible for half the year's amount, even though the eligibility criteria only have to be satisfied annually. Okay. So in other words, we are proposing a fairly narrow approach to the recognition of expense and liability. And moving on, the second question that we'd like you to look at is, given what we've said about the importance of broader financial information, should we be more assertive in saying that entities ought to report on long-term financial sustainability? Should it be mandatory? Or would that deter adoption of IPSAS? Would some jurisdictions not have the capacity to produce this information? Should we as a board even be contemplating going down this route? Should we leave that to regulators? Okay. Ian, anything you want to add before we go on?
No, I think that shows the nature of the questions that, among others, the board is facing at this very moment. And we recognise this is probably one of the most intractable and difficult projects that we've actually faced. But I think we as a board are committed to moving it through to a standard. I think there's no doubt that it's time that we did that. And really, we just want to get as much input as possible to the board's deliberations. We will start deliberating the responses that we receive at our June meeting. And that will be critical to us. So really, we're looking for your input at this stage. So if you can discuss those topics, and then we will come back at 4:10, take some initial feedback, and then we'll wrap up after that in terms of key points from today. Okay, so last discussion for the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Only way to get rid of
Sorry, wrong way. That one.
Don't worry, I normally don't have Okay, so you've had a good quarter of an hour to solve for us a problem that IPSASB has been working on since 2002. So I'm sure we're going to come to a solution. Before we just take comments, actually, I'd just be interested to just get a very immediate show of hands. Just to see where we are in the room on this one. So if I ask question one and ask everyone who agrees with IPSASB's proposed recognition approach, the green option, can you just raise your hands? I was going to say that, so that's unanimously against.
Can I ask who is against IPSASB's proposed approach?
Good. Yeah, interesting.
Depends on what you recognize.
Yeah, and this is a very unscientific. And also, just who's abstaining then, for the sake of argument? Okay.
Who got thoroughly
and if we can
confused.
take question 2, who is in favour of us making guidance on long-term financial sustainability mandatory? I'm not predicating what that should be. Yeah, well, it's interesting then. So that shows, yeah. So
Supporting the balance sheet.
yeah, and who is against that? Well, I mean, I think that was very crude, but it does show you actually how difficult this issue is, because as you say, Johanna, it depends what your solution actually is. But I just thought that was just interesting then, in terms of showing the difficulty that we have as a board in terms of actually moving through to a final standard. Now I'll take just questions and discussion at this point in time. Yeah.
As indicated before, I'm clearly a financial accounting person, so I have a pretty easy view on that. Obviously, by any reasonable standard, liabilities or any obligation should be recognized at the earliest possible date, period. However, the point is not, the point then becomes the measurement. And that's the tricky piece that I think one needs to try to get a handle on, because in corporate reporting we have a service period that we can allocate the expected expense to. What is the service period in public? Now, on a very rough thinking, the net service costs are the service costs less the contribution by the individual. This is all IFRS US GAAP language, so this is not nothing fancy. But that leaves a net service net present value of expected future service costs. There is most likely no investment, so we can leave out the interest portion on the investment end. In the rare circumstances, there may be an asset. And then a possible allocation could be the amount of taxes people reasonably pay. I guess there's no service to the government. Unless it's paid for. If someone is a civil servant or military, you get paid for. That doesn't count. So only the contribution in terms of what I contribute in taxes is possible. I don't have any other suggestion.
And then the question comes, is that specifically towards your pension, or is that tax that you pay generally?
You may consider recognizing a number of types of expenses, being it pension, being it healthcare, being it disability, being it even subsidies for living cost of living, whatever it's going to be. I don't have a full list. I need to start thinking hard. What could be unemployment benefits, less insurance fees, and then they can only be covered out of the total portion of taxes paid. And if I'm looking for some objective criteria how someone could possibly contribute to the expenses incurred by this person being around, it's probably his or her own contribution to the total tax pot, I should say. And if I may, without taking too much of your time, the second question leads into this, because I was about to shout out loud when you mentioned the 5 years. That's about as stupid as expected loss rules take this considering 1 or 2 years. Anyone that runs a bank and thinking of expected losses for 1 or 2 years is not qualified to do so. So it has to be through the cycle, and the cycle could potentially be lifetime. And I gave a very simple example at our table that people can easily follow. which is less complicated than human beings with an unspecified service period and an unspecified cost to maintain, or whatever you want to call it. So these are my fundamental thoughts on this. I'm sure they're not new to you, but technically
I
all this
think
is
that
around.
shows you how difficult it is, because is it exchange, is it non-exchange? Where do you start, where do you stop? Not only with just that narrow category, but the broader categories of expenditure. And do you put the right to tax on balance sheet? Because there is no logic to putting all future costs on the balance sheet if you're not going to put all future tax revenues on the balance sheet.
But what you recognize is only the net.
Sorry?
What you recognize is only the balance. Discount the future expected cash flows from taxes versus.
Which is why is a point estimate actually meaningful? Actually, that's where fiscal sustainability actually becomes more meaningful potentially, because it's a track through time. It's what's the balance between inflows and outflows and all those kinds of things, and is negative net worth, which most governments have, sustainable? So I mean, I think you see the problems we're wrestling with. Other thoughts? I mean, I'm going to ask for people to put just thoughts and questions down, because ultimately the board has to make a decision on what are we going to put in the standard, and
it might be difficult concerning measurement, but I don't think there's a question about the recognition date. I support the alternative view because I think there is no other option. I don't see how being alive can be a recognition criterion, because with that argument you would never count for any accruals for pensions. So I don't see why this should be treated differently.
But this is not an employment pension. That's the difference, because actually people do accrue some form of entitlement through very different mechanisms, and I think with employee pensions it's very clear that's part of the payment package. With a state benefit, a state-paid pension, you don't necessarily have to put anything into that.
Yeah, but I don't think that's relevant in this context, because it doesn't matter whether it's a legal obligation or a factual obligation, like with social benefits. As soon as you've got the obligation, you have to accrue for it, but being alive cannot be the right criterion.
Basically, there's a distinction between what being alive means in those two approaches. As Viola says, being alive for the one would actually very much limit the liability and expense to arguably practically zero. Being alive in the other would simply be one of the attributes you would take into account in the actuarial assessment in order to determine the amount of the liability. So it would be morbidity along with mortality, major factors that the actuary would take into account, and you would get a very different answer.
Yeah. But then you have to say, is that useful information? Yeah. Thomas?
Yeah, I think that is kind of very much going in the direction the CAC discussion went. Obviously, we had a very intensive discussion and a controversial discussion as well, I have to say. It was not a clear cut in terms of consensus. I think probably we had some consensus, or we had consensus regarding support of the obligating event approach. That was homogeneously supported by the CAG. And I think it was a kind of a clear steer, as the colleague just said. If there is an obligation, and if it is a present obligation, it needs to be recognized. I think that was the clear steer from the CAG. However, I think the CAG came to the conclusion that can be different from program to program, and therefore there is not kind of a clear solution when do we have a present obligation and when do we not have a present obligation. I think when it came to staying alive being a recognition criteria or a measurement issue, I think we still had some struggle with that. I think we had opinions saying there needs to be consistency with other long-term obligations, not going in the direction of employee benefits, because actually I think there was an acceptance that there might be a difference between exchange and non-exchange obligations. But still, I think people ask for consistency with other long-term obligations. So there was not really, I wouldn't say there was not, people were against it really, but there was certainly no support for staying alive being a recognition criteria. But in the end, I think it went in the same direction, because in the end you come to the conclusion you have very large liabilities on the balance sheet, and then it was raised the question, how useful is this information provided in the balance sheet in the end? And that is where kind of then the discussion around long-term fiscal sustainability reporting came into play, and the question, is the balance sheet, are the financial statements the right place to solve all these issues and to solve and provide and convey all these messages around these long-lasting liabilities, especially given the fact that the right to tax. So in other words, the financing is not reflected in the balance sheet, and therefore leads to kind of a structural imbalance. So the question is, to what extent do you want to have this imbalance? Because there's always an imbalance because of this funding by future tax inflows. But the question is, to what extent do you want to have that? And that then led the CAG to have a discussion around what is the impact of funding in general. I think it was very clear that there's no direct connectivity between the taxes paid by an individual and the right to receive benefits, because there might be people which have never paid any taxes, but they receive benefits. So probably that's not the right way to do it. The question was really more general. If there is no funding, if the liability is not yet funded, does that exclude the liability from recognition, yes or no? And actually there were some kind of, the general and immediate reaction was the recognition of a liability has to be independent from funding. I think that's our general, probably the general accepted perspective of that. But at the same time, there were voices saying, if there is kind of a question regarding the probability of an outflow, because there's no funding, then the question really is, what is the quality of the obligation to be recognized at that point in time? It was single voices advocating for that, but there were voices going in that direction. So.
And I mean, in some respects, that's consistent with, I sat in on the discussion that the New Zealand Accounting Standard Board had on this, and their concern was, well, if you allow the insurance approach, which is essentially, you know, the kind of net approach, you know, because you bring in the funding, then how consistent are you if you take, you know, the obligating event approach for something that, you know, isn't an insurance-based approach? So, yeah.
And I think exactly, this is where program by program, you probably have to make a decision whether you are in the area of political promises, creating kind of expectations, whether they are valid or not. If it's not funded, there is no whatsoever money to be seen in the future to finance this. So between kind of promises on one side and present obligations on the other side. So, and that is where the CAG struggled, to be honest, in giving a clear steer. Obviously, you didn't expect the CAG solve your problems, but obviously it wasn't the case anyway.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Thomas. Patrice.
Thank you. Well, I have a very strong view on that one. So I would agree with, I would say a lot of things that have been said already. Maybe one thing which is important is not to link it with service, because here it's about, like you said, how an obligation is created, and maybe sometimes it's created many years before the payment is made. So in that respect, really, when it is a case, and I agree that there can be different, fact patterns, circumstances, schemes, etc., that need to be taken into account. So that's the reason why I would say we would be more in the alternative view camp. But really, when the obligation is there, the objective of financial statement, which is one, to be accountable and to be useful for the decision making, well, required to have that on the balance sheet, because otherwise, how can the long-term impact of political decisions be reflected in the financial statement? So it's really a primary objective, and I don't think we can get away with it. What is very dangerous to me is to link it with RPG1. So there is a link, but just to say that because we'll give more information in RPG1, this allows us not to give enough information on the balance sheet, is not the right debate. And especially when, for example, you talk about future taxation, etc. Again, this is about what the accrual accounting is about, is just to make sure that we take stock of reflecting all the consequences of what happened in the past, including the fact of, being alive during a certain period, which gives you a number of credits which build over time. And, in different countries, you can have different responses to how you treat it. But I would say conceptually, just saying it will always be the next payment that I will accrue. So just conceptually, I don't think it is consistent with the framework. It is not consistent with just accrual accounting, and mainly it doesn't give a lot of added value and informative value for the decision making. So this is probably the main point.
Well, I mean, I think, we're not going to solve the issue today. I think we've had the very strong case in favour of the alternative view, but there are equally strong cases for the fact that putting everything, all future costs on the balance sheet, which is the other logical extreme, actually doesn't provide useful information, for decision making. It doesn't provide useful information for accountability purposes. So we have to find a way through the middle of this, which is actually going to work in most cases. And I think one of the things that we have to accept here is as well that there is no magic bullet to this, which actually gives meaningful information across all types of future expenditure, but also all types of future income to which governments are, under tax law and so on, are entitled. So, I don't think we have the final solution on this, but what we are going to have to do is get to an answer. It may not be the final answer.
Yeah.
But, I mean, that's where the board has to get to an answer. And we have to move on from this debate, I think.
Yeah. Maybe if I can just one additional point, because you talk of the insurance approach and you say, okay, then we need to be consistent. Maybe it's good to remind why IFRS 17 in the private sector has been adopted. There, the objective was just to show the performance every year and really show more information about what is driving the profit of insurance company year on year. So there, really the focus has been of giving information on really the profits that private companies are making. Which here, if we are in the private sector, will we ever have any profit on the schemes in already from the start, or only recovery of the costs that are expected in the future? So, again, not sure the background is exactly the same in the two.
I mean, that is why if we retain this, and the board is having a debate whether it should retain it, and if it does, whether it should retain it as an option or something which is required for certain programs, it would only apply to programs which meet fairly clear criteria. They're fully funded, they're managed as an insurance contract, and there are a variety of indicators we've picked out which have been discussed, with experts to ensure that it would only be used under fairly specific circumstances. The issue is, should we be applying it to all those circumstances, or should it, as on that slide, just be an option which is available to those who choose to select a particular accounting policy?
Yeah. and exactly that. And there are, you know, we put forward an optional approach. There are certainly, you know, clear views coming in that it should be mandatory if it fits that, you know, that criterion. So, you know, we're going to have a look at that, but we're going to have to put it alongside things that aren't dealt with through insurance, where we are in the non-exchange environment. So, no, I'm not going to debate this any further, because I think what this has done is it shows how difficult this is, because it does depend on your perspective, and there isn't a complete answer. You know, I mean, the board has chewed this over for 15, 16 years now, and you know, we've got to decide which route we're going to go, and that was part of the tactic actually in the exposure draft, that we wanted to expose both potential options. So we will wait and see what we get back in terms of responses, and I know we will get a range of responses back already from what's been said today, but also from what I know is coming back through a range of different responses. But then the board is going to have to take a view on this, because the debate has to stop. We have to get to an answer.
The ambition is to complete this before my funeral.
Okay, so I think that shows the challenge that the board has ahead of it. We had a session with four of the five predecessors as chairs of the board when we had our Public Sector Standards Assessors Forum last summer in Winterthur, and we had a chair's question time. And John rather blew my punchline, which was going to be his final question as question master was going to be, as chair, is there anything that you would have done differently? And my punchline on that was going to be, have got you lot to have sorted out the difficult issues before I got to be chairman. You know, because each of them had a hand in kicking this particular can down the road. So I think, you know, just going back in terms of today, I think today's actually been incredibly useful for us as a board in terms of input to where we go over what's going to be a very crucial period for us. I think if we review what's actually been said during the day, I think overall in terms of the strategy going forwards, there was clear support for the overall strategy. A reminder, though, that actually we need to pay attention to making sure that if that is the strategic objective, that fits with the mandate and so on. Point taken on that one. I think then in terms of the themes, again, the debate has been fairly much in support of those, although I think drawing on themes D and E, what do we really mean by adoption? What do we mean by implementation? I think that's a very important debate, and it really goes to the heart of where do we go as a board as levels of adoption of our standards increase around the world. So we need to do, I think, further thinking as far as that is concerned. Then in terms of thinking about the projects, I think, again, we've heard support from some for the projects that are proposed, but equally, I think it shows you that there are different views about where we go in future. You know, possibly some disappointment that we're not proposing any work under Theme C at the moment. But I think it's interesting to hear the discussions, and you know, it's going to be interesting to hear the discussion that we've had here put alongside the debates in other parts of the world. You think about natural resources, how important is that going to be going forwards? How important is differential reporting going forward? So I think those discussions are going to be, you know, the feedback we get from you on today is going to be really, I think, really useful. And I think overall, though, in terms of today, and also we've had the immediate feedback in terms of social benefits, which is going to feed into the debate that the board has, which will start back in June, over what's the direction in terms of that programme going forwards. But I think overall the theme very much from my side, and I think from discussion with the other board members, has been that actually the sort of engagement we've had today has been incredibly positive. And, you know, we really will take what you said and feed that back into our processes, you know, as we try and work out what our future direction is going to be, what projects to prioritise to meet your needs, but to meet other stakeholders' needs as well. So I think really just like to finish also by thanking Accountancy Europe in terms of actually having made today possible. I think it has been a milestone for us. It was the first session, and I think it has been tremendously positive, certainly from our side. So thank you for making that possible.
Yeah, and obviously we are approaching the last agenda topic of today before the drinks reception where you're invited to. I think Accountancy Europe has been very proud to host this first roundtable. I think it has been a tremendous success, I would say, having heard the discussion, having heard the lively debate, and I think providing you with an immediate feedback on some of the burning issues. So therefore, I think I want to thank the great staff of Accountancy Europe for the superb work done. Thank you very much for that. I think it has been a success due to your hard work. So thank you very much for that. Before I move on to the last slide for today, and I promise it will be the last slide, I see Katinka through the window staying outside, and she asked me to ask you and this is the only time where you are allowed to look at your mobile phone. She will send, or she has sent already, an email to all participants asking you for a one-click feedback, and it's promised it's only one click, making an assessment whether you found this event helpful, yes or no. And if you could do that, I think that would be tremendously helpful for Accountancy Europe in kind of making their own assessment regarding future events, whether kind of the setting was the right setting. Where I would have an answer already, but Katinka didn't send me an email, I'm sure. So, and this is the promised last slide. And actually, I think what I would like to do is kind of a recap of what has been the discussion with the IPSASB regarding strategy over the years. And you see here the points which we have provided for the last strategy and work plan consultation. And actually, if you look at that, it kind of sounds incredibly current and actual. Because obviously, our advice for the 2015 to 2019 program was please concentrate on standard setting and on filling the gaps. So this is kind of was asking the board to concentrate on the public sector specific issues and concentrate on filling the gaps. Certainly, I think we have talked a lot about these gaps today, and I think the last session was one of the major gaps where the board is working on. The second point was built on existing practices. So, in other words, the ask and the recommendation to involve national standard setters built on the experiences of kind of governments around Europe, at least that was our perspective. And I think not only the IPSAS project, but also your dialogue, which you started, shows that you have listened to that and really followed up on that. And the next 2 points really are actual and current as well. Focus on accruals-based standards and promote the use of accruals. I think that's theme E. It's still relevant, it's still on the agenda, and therefore certainly it is still high on the agenda of Accountancy Europe as well. And the last point, conceptual framework, is important. I think that was against the fact that obviously there was the kind of project starting around conceptual framework. Accountancy Europe asked you to really invest all efforts and endeavors to finalize that, which has been finalized and approved actually here in Brussels in September 2014, which was obviously, again, a good sign for Europe that you have been able to finalize that here in Brussels. So with that, certainly the advice on the new strategy is going to come. That's more a promise than a threat. But certainly we will stay connected to you and maintain the dialogue. And therefore, thank you very much for your openness to listen to the European voice here in Brussels and in Luxembourg and wherever you come to. Thank you very much. And last but not least, thank you all for coming to Brussels, for participating in this great discussion. I think it would not have been working without your contributions and your active participation. Therefore, thank you very much for that. And with that, I think we all deserve a drink. At least I need it. I'm sure you need it too. And with that, enjoy the drink. Thank you very much.
And can you put your voting forms on this desk at the front so we make sure we collect them?
And
Thank
from
you.
an IPSASB staff perspective, if I could thank the Accountancy Europe staff, and in particular Katinka, without Katinka's organisational ability, I don't think today would have gone ahead. So thank you. Okay.